Recently, I just finished reading a book by Rachel Held Evans, a great writer who was taken from us far too young. And as she was writing about some of the ways in which we use the Bible, she made a point that she had never heard anyone preach a sermon on Titus, chapter 1, verse 12, the verse that says, "Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons." Now, we claim to take the Bible seriously. Many even claim to take it literally all the time, to believe everything it says. If that is the case, Evans argued, well, then why is no one preaching about how awful people are who are from Crete? Why aren't we marching, holding signs, declaring that anyone who comes from Crete cannot be trusted, must not be believed? Why haven't we attempted to cancel celebrities who have Cretan ancestries? Why aren't Jennifer Aniston, Zach Galifianakis, and Nana Mouskouri, all of whom have parents who came from that island in the Mediterranean, why aren't they all banned from our churches? Bible says it. Couldn't be clearer. After quoting this saying, attributing it to some Cretan prophet, the writer goes on to add, "This testimony is true." Well, if it's true, why don't we talk about that truth? Why, Evans wanted to know, don't we preach about this verse? Now, I'm going to confess something to you. There is one way that you can manipulate me as a preacher. If you suggest to me that no one has ever preached on a particular passage of Scripture, and especially if you suggest that people are afraid to talk about a verse, well, nothing is going to want to make me preach that sermon more. So, let's tackle it. Let's tackle the question of just how lazy and unreliable people who are from Crete really are. What is that saying doing in our Bible? And what are we going to do with it? The difficult thing about the saying is, of course, that it's such a blanket statement. It doesn't say that sometimes some people from Crete can be duplicitous. It doesn't say, hey, I once knew a guy from Crete who told me a lie. No, it's a blanket statement about all Cretans. Now, I got to admit, I never hear anybody saying such things about people from Crete today. But it is the kind of statement I do hear all the time. I hear people say awful, ignorant things that I am not at all willing to repeat about, for example, all Palestinians or all Jews or all Muslims. I also hear generalized statement about what is wrong with all Republicans or all liberals or all socialists. Why, even the U.S. president the other day made that kind of statement about all Iranians. I could go on, but you get the idea. You've heard people say that kind of thing. If you hang out on the internet, you can read such absolute blanket statements all the time. And they're not helpful statements. I would suggest to you that they are statements that are polarizing our discourse and destroying the fabric of our society more than almost anything else these days. So I feel as if I hear that enough of that kind of rhetoric in our modern world. I'm not happy. I'm not happy to find it in my Bible, but it is in my Bible. And for me, that means I need to deal with it. It means I need to try and understand what the writer was trying to get across, both to his immediate audience and to us, reading over some 2,000 years later. So let me ask, what if something more is going on in this verse than meets the eye? Because here's one thing. It doesn't exactly say that all Cretans are liars. it says that somebody said that all Cretans are liars. Well, who said it? The letter refers to some prophet, doesn't name him, but we actually know who this prophet was. His name was Epimenides of Knossos. And he was famous for saying this, in fact. He lived about 6 centuries before this letter was ever written, and yet he was still one of the most famous sons of Crete in that time. He was known as a highly respected philosopher, poet, and yes, he was called a prophet. This saying, in fact, was famous because it was known as Epimenides' paradox. There's an old episode of Star Trek called I, Mud. And in this episode, the crew lands on a planet that is ruled by androids who are perfectly logical. It's an idyllic planet in many ways, but there is one flaw. The androids won't let anybody leave. So the crew needs to come up with a plan to break android control, kind of like we may need to do when AI takes over our society. Star Trek is nothing if not a reflection of modern problems. So this is the plan that the crew comes up with. They begin to act in crazy, irrational ways. And their craziness begins to overtax the data centers of the planet as they try to process this weird behavior. And then the coup de grace is delivered when Captain Kirk says this about one of the characters to the head android, whose name is Norman. Everything Harry tells you is a lie, Kirk says. Remember this. Everything Harry tells you is a lie. And then Harry says to the head android, now listen to me carefully, Norman. I am lying. Now, I'm going to give you Norman's response verbatim. It's so perfect. Norman says, you say you are lying, but if everything you say is a lie, then you are telling the truth. But you cannot tell the truth because everything you say is a lie, but you lie. You tell the truth, but you cannot, for you lie. Illogical, illogical. And then the entire planetary system blows up because it cannot process such an illogical statement. Well, that episode is actually a perfect illustration of Epimenides' paradox. But Star Trek didn't invent it. It was invented by Epimenides 600 years before the time of Christ. So, when Epimenides said, Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons, he said it as a Cretan, and one who was highly respected. So how do you think he expected people to react? Do you think he was expecting everyone to just nod and say, yeah, that testimony is true? Cretans are truly awful people. No, of course not. He expected people to respond a la Norman and say, you say Cretans always lie, but if you are a Cretan, then that statement is a lie. But if it is a lie, then Cretans do not always lie, and you may be telling the truth. But if you are telling the truth, then the statement is false. You tell the truth, but you are a liar. Illogical, illogical. See, it turns out that Epimenides only said that to illustrate how irrational it is to make blanket statements about groups of people. And like I say, this saying of Epimenides was famous in the ancient world. It was famous for this reason. It was used to teach students not to make foolish blanket statements. So here's my question. When this famous saying appears in the letter to Titus, how's it being used? Is the writer taking the statement at face value and affirming that, yes, all Cretans are truly awful people? Or Is he aware of the original, famous intent of the statement? Is he affirming the irrationality of saying such things? This letter to Titus is traditionally attributed to the Apostle Paul. And I'm going to affirm to you that if Paul wrote this letter, there is no way that he would have missed the philosophical meaning of this saying. Paul, in all of his letters, writes in such a way that demonstrates that he has been trained in Greek rhetorical and philosophical techniques. Paul would have known about Epimenides' paradox. Now, modern New Testament scholars argue that this letter was not written by Paul. They say it can't have been because it deals with matters and concerns that only arose after Paul's death. Instead, they argue it was written by someone who maybe felt inspired by God to write to the church the wisdom that he believed Paul would have given them to face the new challenges that had arisen after his death. Now, I am not going to delve into the question of the authorship of this letter here. I'm just going to say, I think it's pretty clear whoever wrote this letter was no fool. And so when he tells his reader about this famous saying from a Cretan philosopher, I think he does recognize the logical paradox at work in it. But even more importantly, even though he says that testimony is true, he actually doesn't believe that Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons. Because, of course, the whole point of this letter is that he wants Titus to help the Christians who live on Crete to be good and noble and righteous. And that would be simply impossible if they were always liars, vicious brutes, and lazy gluttons. So I'm left with the conclusion that this blanket statement appears in the letter for the same reason that Epimenides said it in the first place. He's writing to teach his readers how foolish it is to adopt such attitudes towards any group. He's trying to show them that stereotyping, racism, exclusion, they're all illogical. Now, really, such a notion should hardly be surprising to Christians, who are followers, after all, of the one who challenged his disciples, saying, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now, Jesus did not invent the notion of loving your neighbor. It was a command that even in his time, all Jews agreed was at the very heart of the Old Testament law. Love thy neighbor. But they had always understood this command in a very particular way. They had always had a very clear understanding of who their neighbor was. Your neighbor was your fellow Israelite. Your neighbor was someone who shared your culture, your language, and your religion. And so for as long as this teaching, this law had existed, no one had seen a conflict between loving your neighbor and believing that Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, lazy gluttons. But Jesus shattered that understanding of the command. Here, and in other famous passages, like especially the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus showed that the love that is owed to the neighbor extends further, extends to the very people that you are least comfortable loving. And this was a radical idea. But Jesus said that you had to behave in this way in order to reflect the true nature of God. He insists you should do it so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. He taught us that by loving those who are most different from you, you become most like God. We live in an increasingly polarized world. And one of the symptoms of that polarization is that we're all surrounded constantly by people telling us that we cannot have peace, that we cannot work with certain groups because they are always liars, or they are all vicious brutes, or they are lazy gluttons, or they have other shared traits that make them completely evil. And this is not just a minor problem. Such attitudes are killing thousands of people daily. They start wars. They prevent wars from ending. We see it right now, a constant illustration alongside the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. It's threatening to tear whole countries apart, including our own, my friends. And we need an antidote to such rhetoric. And we have it. We have it in Epimenides, who demonstrated that such thinking is illogical and self-defeating. But of course, even more important, we have it in Jesus, who taught us that the practice of love must extend to those we find hardest to love. And so we have the antidote. How do we deploy it? There's only one way. We need to start living out this teaching of Jesus and do it in the most radical way we can. We need to welcome the stranger. We need to reach out to the hated Samaritan. We need to love the lazy, vicious, lying brood of a Cretan enough to get to know them and realize they are none of those things. And I know it's a small thing if we just do it ourselves. But that's where true revolutions begin, in the small things. And when we can show the world that it can be done, well, then new possibilities are going to arise everywhere. That's the challenge Jesus left for us. And so I'm going to leave you with a challenge. This week, I challenge you to reach out to someone whom you have been taught is unacceptable because of the political or ethnic or religious or whatever other group they belong to. I want you to try to get to know them as a person, not just as a member of their group. That's where it starts. Loving your neighbor like Jesus taught us to love. That's how we bring a better world into view. Teach us, Lord, to love our neighbors. Amen.